Welcome to Migration Mastery. Before we touch a single rule, let's answer the question your boss probably skipped. Why now? The honest answer isn't that nftables is cooler. It's that a chain of decisions stretching back to 2014 has quietly moved the ground under iptables. Kernel 3.13 shipped nftables, RHEL 8 made it default in 2019, Debian 11 followed in 2021, and RHEL 7 hit end of life in 2024. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to write that business case yourself. Timeline, sources, and EOL pressures included. So here's what you're actually building over the next 11 slides. 4 pieces of evidence that fit together into one airtight document. The nftables timeline itself, from kernel 3.13 to today. The distro adoption dates, RHEL 8, Debian 11, Ubuntu 22, so you know exactly when the default flipped. The NetFilter project's own public position on iptables because you'll need a citable source. And finally, the EOL dates hitting your specific fleet. Not opinions, evidence. Start with the timeline itself. In 2014, the kernel team merged nftables into Linux 3.13, that's the starting gun. 5 years later, RHEL 8 ships with nftables as the default in compatible mode. Debian follows with Bullseye in 2021, Ubuntu with Jammy in 2022. RHEL 7 hits end of life in June 2024, and by 2026, iptables is in LTS mode. No new features, just maintenance. 12 years of structural change and your fleet is somewhere on this line. So pull that timeline down to your actual fleet. Anything still on RHEL 7, CentOS 7, or Debian Buster is already past end of life. That's not a migration anymore. That's an audit finding. Ubuntu 20.04 is the next cliff, under 6 months out. Debian Bullseye gives you until August 2026, and RHEL 8 buys you the most runway at May 2029. Everything else, RHEL 9, Debian 12, Ubuntu 22.04, is already on the modern stack. Your job is to map each line here to a host count. Now, when a stakeholder pushes back and asks who actually made this call, you don't have to argue from preference. The NetFilter project, the same kernel team that wrote iptables, explicitly states nftables is what they support upstream. Red Hat made it the default backend in RHEL 8 back in 2019. Debian followed in Bullseye in 2021. 3 independent sources, 1 consistent message. The decision was made years ago, upstream. Here's where the framing matters for your stakeholders. Iptables isn't deprecated, it still works, packets still flow, but it's frozen. No new features, contributions discouraged, docs stuck in 2018, and the kernel team only does minimum support because iptables now runs on the nftables backend anyway. That distinction is what your audit team will flag. Maintenance-only software triggers unsupported risk in compliance frameworks, narrows vendor contracts, and makes recruitment harder every year. Frozen is worse than deprecated because it looks fine until it doesn't. So let's turn all of that evidence into something you can actually hand to a decision maker. Open a Confluence page or a Word doc, title it iptables-to-nftables Migration Project, Background, and structure it as 5 short sections. Strategic context, vendor positions with citations, your specific deadlines pulled from the CMDB, the risk of inaction, and a clear recommendation. Every data point you need is already in this lesson. You're just assembling it. Keep it tight, cite your sources, and end with a concrete ask. Approve the structured migration plan we'll build in Lesson 7. Now, before you hand that document over, you need to be able to answer one question yourself. Why did the kernel developers build a whole new tool instead of just patching iptables? 3 reasons. Iptables walked rules linearly, so 10,000 rules meant 10,000 steps per packet. Fine in 2001, broken at cloud scale. You had 5 separate tools, iptables, IP6 tables, arptables, ebitables, ipset, each with its own syntax, and atomic updates were bolted onto iptables restore as an afterthought. nftables fixes all 3 structurally by design. And once you've made that argument, you need to back it with sources stakeholders can't dismiss. 3 columns here: the kernel team's own pages, the vendor release notes from Red Hat, Debian, Ubuntu, and SUSE, and the EOL date references. Drop these URLs straight into your Confluence page. Trust me, the NetFilter project lands very differently than my team thinks, especially in a room full of skeptical directors. Now it's your turn to do the work. 3 drills, and notice, none of them happen in a terminal. The first is a 20-minute audit. Tally your fleet by OS version and EOL urgency. The second is the big one, 30 minutes to write the 5-paragraph case using the template from earlier. And the third, 15 minutes, is naming your stakeholders and the specific fear each one carries. Do these in order, and by the end, you'll have the kickoff doc, not just notes about one. Before you start writing, a warning about how these cases get killed. 5 framing mistakes, and they're all self-inflicted. Selling modernity instead of risk, vague timelines with no urgency, no vendor citations to back you up, skipping the CMDB count so your scope is hand-wavy, and treating it as an IT-only project instead of looping security and compliance in early. Each one has a fix. Lead with risk of inaction, cite specific EOL dates, quote Red Hat and netfilter.org, run the query first, and bring your allies in before the blockers arrive. And that's lesson 1 in the bank. You've got the 12-year timeline, the vendor citations, the fleet deadlines, and a kickoff doc that frames this as risk, not preference. The case is documented. It's no longer your opinion, it's a paper trail. In lesson 2, we shift from why to what. Which parts of your iptables mental model carry over, which don't, and where your team actually needs to relearn. See you there.